Hi, I'm Jack Zenger. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, um, Fresh Facts about Feedback. I'm joined today by two colleagues. Happens that Joe Folkman is here in the Utah office with me, although we're in separate offices, properly social distancing. We're also joined by our colleague, Jim Foster, who's in Boston. Jim will be the one who will be managing our chat function today. So Jim, just tell them a little bit about you and what you will be doing, please.
Thank you very much, Jack. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Foster, the Zenger Folkman Senior Client Executive based here in Boston. Thank you for joining today's presentation. I will be monitoring the chat during the presentation and responding to questions and going over appropriate follow-up where that may be appropriate. So look forward to doing that. And also we'll be back at the end of the presentation to talk about a special offer on one of our workshops. So I'll look forward to seeing you then and enjoy the presentation.
Joe would like to ask our participants a couple of questions, so I'll give the ball to you.
Hey, thank you, Jack. And it's great to be here. We're going to talk about feedback today. Start off with this question. An effective manager has the responsibility to provide their direct reports with corrective feedback when team members make a mistake. And you should see a poll coming up where you can agree or disagree with that statement. You know, Jack, I was thinking about this statement, but it's not only managers. I mean, we've all seen those signs. If you see something, say something. And I think people generally feel a responsibility. If something's wrong, they have an obligation, a duty to kind of tell people about it, don't they?
Many times they think that.
Well, you know, it is a pretty strong desire we have to, and most people feel this sense of obligation that they are responsible, that if they see something wrong, they need to correct it. It's their job, it's their responsibility. Well, Terry, let's see what we're seeing for results there. Wow. Only 95% agree with that statement. And that's a pretty large poll. We have about 500 people on this webinar today. So strong agreement that it's a manager's responsibility. In fact, it's an individual's responsibility that they should give people feedback if there's mistakes or if there's problems. We asked this question of 1,200 people. The thing that would help most employees improve their performance is being given specific constructive suggestions on how to improve, or being given regular recognition and praise. And 555 people, 82% agree with A. Now that's, this issue. And I think for most of us, we've had an experience where we got some very helpful and useful corrective feedback, and it was very beneficial to us. But this leads to some interesting, I guess, problems when it comes to feedback. And so, Jack, tell us a little bit about that and what happens.
So as many of you know on this call, our firm emphasizes the importance of multi-rater feedback, and we've had a chance to observe lots of people receiving a feedback report. What we observe is that when people get their report, there's a very common tendency for them to immediately begin flipping through it. When you watch what they do, they're clearly looking for that one page in the report that tells them what they do badly, what they do wrong, what their weaknesses are. And there's just this very consistent tendency to look for their weaknesses. Now, those of you who know our work and know our research know that we're a great believer in the importance of strengths. And we found that probably 70% of the time, people would be much better off looking for the things that they do rather well and how they could do those even better. And only, 30% of the time is it probably the best avenue to kind of look for what you do that may be getting in your way or to kind of focus on your weakness. But we just see this very common tendency for people to look for negative feedback. Now, why do people do that? Leaders say they want, this. They say they want to be told what's wrong. Um, Usually we take things that people say at face value, but I'm going to suggest to you that in this particular case, we think there may be some kind of tempering factors. So the 93% of people agree with the statement that negative feedback, if delivered appropriately, is effective at improving performance. Why would such a high percentage of people say that? And we think there are several reasons. One is that it plays on a very old belief that lots of us have about how do you get better. This belief that we get better by finding and fixing our weaknesses goes back to our days as kids in elementary school and junior high school and high school. Teachers tended to focus on the mistakes that we made on our arithmetic paper, or they focus on the spelling mistakes that we made. There has been this long tradition. Many companies' performance management systems were very geared toward pointing out people's weaknesses. A second possible reason is that saying that you want to receive negative feedback gives you the appearance of, displaying courage and strength. We think a third possibility is that many people think that's what you're supposed to do, that if you're a good employee, that you are supposed to want to receive feedback that would be corrective, that would tell you what you're not doing, that would tell you how to do it better. It's also, there's some logic to acknowledging that we all make mistakes, and sometimes we're aware of them and sometimes we're not. And there's certainly times when it's useful to receive information that you may be blind to that would help you become more effective. Indeed, the very definition of feedback for many people, when you say, I have some feedback for you, the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of people is, oh, this is negative. This is going to be critical. This is going to be pointing out my flaws and failings. So we think there are many reasons why people do that. So Joe, kind of tell us a little bit about what our data shows from our research.
So here's what we did. We created this self-assessment that measures your preferences for giving and receiving feedback, both positive and negative. Now, we've given this to 12,000 people across the globe. So we have we've got a lot of data on this, and we're really confident in our answers. Now, the exciting part about this for you is that at the end of the webinar here, we're going to give you a chance to do a mini feedback assessment on yourself to see your preferences for giving positive and negative feedback. So you can actually do this test on yourself. Now, here's what's interesting when we look at the data from these 12,000 people. 62%, the strongest preference we have, 62% prefer to give people negative feedback. Now that's amazing. And it's not really too amazing because people say they want negative feedback. And so, of course, 62% of the leaders that we've gathered data on have a very strong preference for giving negative feedback. And here's another thing that I find interesting. 36% avoid giving positive feedback. Now, this baffles me a little bit. I mean, most people agree that giving negative feedback is kind of hard, but isn't it easier to give positive feedback? I mean, wouldn't you want to? And what the heck could be wrong with giving positive feedback? Jack, you got a theory about this? That why are people resistant about giving positive feedback?
Well, my best guess, Joe, is that some managers are fearful that if they give lots of positive feedback to one of their colleagues, that they will be expecting a promotion or a salary increase, or that they will read more into it than really exists. I don't happen to think those are valid reasons, but I think that may be why some are hesitant about doing it. And again, it gets back to some of the things I talked about earlier, and that is I think it's expected of me. If I'm a manager, I think that's what I'm supposed to be doing. And so it's a complex issue, as we will explore in the rest of this webinar together.
Well, and here's, we're going to enhance this story a little bit, because what we asked people that did the self-assessment is we asked them to rate themselves as highly effective at providing others honest, straightforward feedback, how good they were at it. And so we divided these preferences into 4 different groups. We have the avoids group. In other words, they avoid giving positive, avoid giving negative. And we found that only 29.9% of them rated themselves as effective at providing others with straightforward feedback. Now, if they avoided giving positive, but they preferred giving negative, wow, that really jumps up. 72.3% said that they were good at giving it. But then on the opposite, if they avoided positive, or they give positive but avoids negative, okay, this third category. So if you tend to give people positive feedback, then they rated themselves just at the 40th percentile. So they didn't feel like if they were giving positive feedback, they were as effective at getting honest, straightforward feedback. And then the gives positive and gives negative, the people that did both, they're at 79%. They're our strongest group. So this is how people felt about their effectiveness. In other words, the people that felt like they were more willing to give negative feedback rate themselves higher. They think they're better at giving honest, straightforward feedback. And the people that give both positive and negative think they're pretty good at giving honest, straightforward feedback. So Jack, what does this mean? What's the implications of this?
So let's just see if we can summarize here. The fact is, if leaders give only one kind of feedback, those who give the tough feedback think they are better at developing others. And leaders who rate themselves highest tend to give both kinds of feedback. But the big question is, do the recipients agree? We would argue that the recipients are the really key people in this equation. Do the recipients think that managers who give them one kind of feedback are more effective than the other? And so Joe kind of reviewed the data with us about what we found giving that.
So here's what we did. We matched up the self-assessment data with 360 assessments from others, okay? Manager, direct report, peers, and others. And we asked the question, and we asked people to rate a manager's effectiveness, the person that did this self-assessment. Well, are they good? How good are they at giving honest, straightforward feedback? How good are they? And here's what we found. On the avoids group, that group was at the 44th percentile. Now, the group that avoids giving positive but prefers to give negative, and remember, this was the second highest group in the self-assessments. These people thought they did a very good job. Is this number going to go up or down? It goes down. When the people that are receiving it are rating them at the 39th percentile, they're rating them as being worse. Now, remember the gives positive but avoids giving negative group, they rated themselves lower on the self-assessment, but how did other people perceive it? Look, they rate themselves at the 51st percentile, and the gives both positive and negative. They also rated when they're, again, these are ratings from others at the 51st percentile. Now, Jack, this is compelling data. We're matching up a self-assessment about how people prefer to give feedback with feedback from others about how they're receiving it. And what the implications of this is very clear, that the lowest rated group here were the group that preferred negative and avoided positive. And again, the people that tended to prefer positive and avoid negative, they're at the 51st percentile. The people that did both were also at the 51st percentile. Let me show you another item that we looked at here, and that's a broader category of how effective people were at developing others. And what we're going to see is a very similar trend. Again, the avoid group, 41st percentile. Again, the avoids giving positive, they go down to the 39th percentile, and then gives positive but avoids giving negative, 52nd percentile, and then the gives both positive and negative, 53rd percentile. So we're finding the same trend. We're finding that the people that had a preference, those leaders that had a preference for giving negative feedback and avoiding positive feedback, they thought they were doing the right thing. They thought this was helping, and guess what? It's hurting. It's actually hurting. And then we looked at one other factor, and that is overall leadership effectiveness rating. Now, again, these leaders that thought they're doing a good job, and they thought that this is the job I'm giving because they avoid the positive and give the negative. When you look at the data, the thing that was hurting was they were hurting themselves. They were actually rated only at the 40th percentile, but the people that gave both positive and they avoided negative were at the 52nd percentile, and the people that gave both positive and negative were at the 49th percentile. Those are significant differences. The implications of this, I think, are really significant. People that have a tendency to just give negative feedback are rated, and they're thinking they're helping, they're thinking they're doing their job, but it not only doesn't help them. I mean, they're actually rated lower on both giving feedback and developing others, but it's hurting their overall effectiveness as a leader. It is making them a worse leader. This is fascinating to me. Jack, what do you see anything else in that?
No, this is very fascinating data, and it's this interesting dichotomy between what people think is doing good when they're functioning as a leader and giving feedback, and what the recipients are responding to. So let's just talk a little bit about the dangers of giving only corrective feedback.
There's some implications of this, that you give just negative feedback, team members feel judged, and they feel they feel like you're only looking for what's wrong. That's really what happens. So yeah, what are the dangers, Jack?
Absolutely. So the dangers are that when the leader does that, it damages the relationship, and a leader's effectiveness is very much contingent upon the strength of the bond or the relationship between them and the people they work with. It generally creates a negativity, which has been found to reduce, aspirations and people's willingness to put forth extra effort. Corrective critical messages trigger a response in the brain. Cortisol is released. People, feel are under attack, and it's because of this that a number of organizations have really rethought their performance management systems, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. We think that it's fascinating that this research, this conclusion, shows up in other branches of science. There's a well-known kind of an institute in Seattle called the Relationship Research Lab. A man named John Gottman has received a lot of attention over the last many years because of his work with married couples. It's been found that if he and his team can spend 3 hours with a couple, record their interactions when they're talking about things just in general, or if they're talking about some contentious issue, we can predict with 90% accuracy whether that couple will go through a divorce within the next couple of years or not. What is he looking for? And the research is that he's looking for the ratio of positive comments made by one to the other versus negative comments. And if there's a ratio of about 5 positive to at least to 1 negative, there's a high probability that they would stay together. He has this interesting metaphor. He says it's a little bit like a salt shaker. If you fill the salt shaker with yeses, every grain of yes kind of combines to make a full salt shaker. It's when you begin to mix in a whole bunch of no's that it becomes a very negative and not so pleasant outcome for the couple. So in other branches of science, the importance of positive interactions and positive comments from one person to another has been confirmed.
Isn't this, that's really fascinating research, Jack, and it really does, and it's interesting here because it's not 5-0.
No.
There is a place for corrective feedback, but it's 5-1. And I shouldn't have told my wife this. She started counting up. Anyway, oftentimes a lot of people feel like that. I don't know if you had this experience where you've watched somebody performing or doing something and you notice something they did wrong. And you say to yourself, oh, they didn't recognize they did that wrong. They didn't see that they did that wrong. And so you feel an obligation, you're really just trying to help because these people, they missed it. They obviously, if they knew this, they wouldn't have done it. And so you really try to kind of correct the mistake, and you tell them. We ask people how often when they get feedback, did they already know? When was this a surprise to you? How often? And what we found is 72% of the time, people know what they did wrong. I mean, you think they're clueless most of the time. They're not clueless. They know they made a mistake. And when you tell them that they made a mistake, oftentimes you just rub salt in the wound a little bit. And so the implications here is if you have a preference for giving people positive feedback, team members feel valued. They feel appreciated. Your spouse feels valued and appreciated. This preference for giving positive feedback. And you noticed that the people that preferred positive and avoided negative, those numbers were just as high as the people that did both. It's just really interesting how that effect that has. But when people feel valued and appreciated, then you can give corrective feedback and it doesn't have a negative effect. And then, the implication of this, or you get higher ratings on feedback, on how well you develop people, and on overall leadership effectiveness. And those were all statistically significant findings in terms of the data that we found there. So I think that's really very compelling evidence.
It is. And it's interesting that this research is finding its way into practical applications. A number of big organizations have experimented with implementing what we're talking about. In the October 2016 issue of Harvard Business Review, there's a really good article by a Wharton professor and a colleague from NYU called The Performance Management Revolution. They talk about Adobe and Dell and Microsoft and Accenture. And we've talked to some people in Accenture. Accenture has tried a very bold experiment with their performance management in having only positive feedback, doing away with traditional ratings. They mandated that all feedback in a performance management discussion would be positive. And what they found was that the employees liked it. The firm has moved forward. High percentage of people praising this change in their system. We're seeing a number of other organizations experiment with this. So we think that the implications are very strong for a practical application inside a company. Let's talk a little bit about this, the giving positive feedback. We know that there are some ways to do it. We know that there's positive outcomes. It creates a better mood when done properly. It's very appropriate for certain people and certainly during specific times. There are good and bad ways of doing it. So let's just talk a little bit about the good ways of doing it. Positive feedback is most beneficial when it's specific. It isn't the general attaboy, good job, thanks very much. It's when you describe the consequences of what the person has done, the specific things that they did, and you as the colleague convey your personal reaction, your personal appreciation for what they're doing. So there are lots of formulas for giving positive feedback, but obviously when it's done well, it really does have beneficial effects. And similarly, on the other side, when corrective feedback is, when it's done well, it can have some positive effects too. If the person who's receiving it knows that the purpose is purely to be helpful, again, if it's balanced with a much higher percentage of positive feedback interactions. And again, when that feedback is specific, when you can describe the consequences of what the person did, and then when you kind of approach it as a joint problem-solving discussion, how the two of you together can find a way going forward that will kind of remedy this situation. And when the person leaves with the assurance from you that you want to really help them, and that it's forward-looking, that it's not just a look in the rearview mirror, but it's really looking to the future to make it better. When those elements come together, then corrective feedback can have some very beneficial effects.
So Jack, we have a recommendation here. And the first recommendation is that it looks to us, and the research confirms it, that giving positive feedback, having a preference for doing that, really helps you be better at giving feedback, better at developing others, and helps you in terms of it will improve your overall leadership effectiveness. That's our first recommendation. Here's our second recommendation. We think this is, it's time to do this. We think that this recommendation could have a significant positive impact on your culture. And it's to create a culture in your organization where people more often ask for feedback from others. Now, let me show you why we're giving you this recommendation. And I'm going to show you some data from 87,000 global leaders. And what we looked at is their effectiveness, a leader's effectiveness at asking for and acting on feedback, just those two skills, and the impact that has on overall leadership effectiveness. And what you see here is a dramatic impact. When people ask for feedback, they tend to get better as a leader. Several years ago, I was giving my son-in-law a ride to the airport. He had just gotten his first job out of college. He got his master's degree and he got a really good job. And so on the way to the airport, he asked me, he says, what's the one thing that you think I ought to do to be successful in my job? And when he said that, I thought, one thing? I never tell people one thing. Give me five. Or one thing's really hard. But I looked at it and I just run this data and I said, here's my recommendation. Start right now and continue to ask for feedback on a regular basis, because people who ask for feedback end up being much more effective leaders. And if you look at this, you can see the impact that has, and it's dramatic. Now, I want to comment on this a little bit, Jack, but why don't you chime in on this and talk about it?
So I suspect that many of you, like I, get a morning news feed. And it was fascinating that in this morning's news feed, there was an article cited by Warren Buffett. Now, all of us know Warren Buffett, not as a particularly a management guru, but as more of a very wise investor. But Warren Buffett was talking about the one quality that he's observed is most correlated with successful business executives. And it was fascinating that it was this practice of them asking for feedback from their colleagues and having the humility to kind of listen to them and respond to that. Our observation is that when people ask for feedback, it puts them in a much better position to be willing to kind of receive it in a positive way and then to act on it. When we make the effort to, and we seek feedback from other people, it increases significantly our willingness to do something about it. It recognizes that other people do see things on occasion that we're blind to, and that we appreciate them, and that we're humble enough to kind of ask for their opinion, and we respect their point of view, and we believe that they have value, and we give them dignity, and we elevate them by asking for their opinion about how we could do something better. And there's just no question that other people appreciate the humility kind of associated with asking for feedback. And so, like Joe, when one of my grandchildren, and I happen to have quite a few of them, ask me what they can do, I say to them, make it a practice to ask your colleagues what ideas they see, what things that they see that you could do differently, to do better, start doing that you're not doing. You'll be amazed at what a response you get. It isn't a sign of weakness, not a sign of kind of lack of confidence. It's a sign of courage, it's a sign of self-confidence when you do that.
It's definitely true, Jack. And we have a compelling story here, because if we look at this practice of asking for feedback, and then we look at it by age groups, well, guess what we find? The young are pretty good at it. I mean, they're at the 54th percentile. But as people get older, you can see that the practice of asking for feedback goes down. Now, Jack and I talked about this, and we thought, why is it that older people ask for feedback less often? Could it be they ask for feedback because they're more effective leaders? I mean, are older people more effective leaders than younger people? And so they don't need to ask for feedback because they're so good. Now, you may, Jack and I look pretty young, but we are a little bit older. and Jack, when you and I have talked about this before, what was our theory about why older leaders should be more effective?
Well, they should be more effective because they've had more experience and they've learned lots of good lessons. But as you're about to show our participants here today, that just isn't the case. And
Yep, here's the data. And again, this is from 63,000 leaders. So we've got really good evidence here that suggests that leaders over time, they get worse. They don't get better unless they ask for feedback. Because if they keep asking for feedback, you see that line going up. I think that's fascinating. I think that is really fascinating because the leaders that kept asking for feedback, they saw improvement over time. And so this practice of asking for feedback has some really strong implications. Now, in our self-assessment, we not only ask about giving feedback, but we ask people's preferences for receiving feedback. And again, you have a positive and negative feedback. And so you have the I avoid receiving positive, avoid receiving negative. And then we match this up with 360 data that measured their effectiveness on making a real effort to change based on feedback from others. People who avoided receiving positive and negative were at the 43rd percentile. Now, remember the group that avoided receiving or avoided giving on the giving positive, but preferred negative on the giving. Now, this is the receiving. You remember this went down on the giving, but look what happens when people avoid receiving positive, but they prefer giving negative or receiving negative feedback. It actually goes up. We found that having a preference or having a willingness to receive negative feedback was a really good thing. Now, it's kind of a bad thing to give it, but it's a good thing to want it yourself because you're looking for what you can do to improve. And again, those people that avoided receiving positive, but or preferred giving, they preferred positive feedback, receiving positive feedback, but they avoided negative. That goes down to the 40th percentile. But if they preferred both positive and negative, it goes up to the 50th percentile. Our sense here is that there's some really positive things that come when a person has a preference, when they really want to hear some corrective feedback, when they have a personal desire to receive it. So that was a little confusing, but it sort of makes sense in terms of the implications of that. Jack, what do you think as you've looked at this data? Is this making sense to you?
it is, but I think what we're seeing is that it's not a simple kind of topic. It is clear, so let's just kind of summarize. When people have a preference for receiving only positive feedback, what we see is it would be greatly enhanced by team members asking for feedback, but along with wanting only positive comments, if they're open to having observations about their performance, that does create a healthier climate.
Yeah, and this idea that when you have a preference to receive both positive and negative, and then asking for feedback and they're open to receive negative feedback, positive and negative feedback is provided. Again, what we found in our data is that in those cases, they got higher ratings on integrity and honesty, which was interesting to me, that this willingness to receive negative feedback really increased their scores on their honesty and integrity, on their learning agility, and they're willing to try to learn from feedback. But it also helped on relationship building, that they were better at relationship building because of their openness to receiving negative feedback. So that was a really interesting implication from that.
So as we come to the ending of this webinar, let's just talk a little bit about the fundamental assumptions that we've all had about the feedback process in an organization. Historically, our fundamental assumption has been that it's a manager's duty, responsibility, privilege, whatever you want to describe it, to give feedback to their subordinates. We've seen it as a kind of a cascading downward. What we've seen is that direct reports, the subordinates, often tend to wait for their manager to give them feedback rather than them asking for feedback. And this results in many managers feeling a lot of stress about giving feedback to their direct reports. Many direct reports kind of resisting feedback. And by the accounts of many people, the annual performance appraisal process was perceived as being a very negative, very distressing kind of procedure for most people. We would hope that maybe some of these assumptions might change. If everyone was encouraged to regularly ask their colleagues for feedback, rather than waiting for the managers to provide the feedback, if we could flip this whole thing upside down, if we could encourage managers to ask their direct reports for feedback. Think of what an example that would be to all the people in the organization. By them being a role model and asking for feedback about themselves. Think about how this would change the whole procedure, that the feedback process was an upward in a direction, and people would ask for feedback, and therefore they would be more willing to take that feedback and act upon it. And so we think that maybe the time has come for us to kind of rethink this whole fundamental expectation. We believe feedback is a very positive, beneficial gift that can be given, but how much better it would be if managers asked for feedback, and then if direct reports, frontline employees, rather than waiting for their manager to give them feedback, if they kind of periodically triggered that discussion and said, I'd really appreciate having some ideas about what's one thing I could do better in my job. So if employees want more feedback, which almost invariably they say they do, what would happen if we, rather than expecting the manager to initiate that conversation always, what if we put the onus on the employee to say, okay, you're in control. You can trigger this event. You can cause this to happen. And when you do that, it will be far more comfortable for you, far more comfortable for the boss, and probably will result in you taking action on it to a much greater degree.
It's so interesting that when people ask, they're just in such better shape to hear something. I mean, everybody feels ambushed when they sit down and they're just given the feedback. But when you ask for it, it's like, hey, I asked for it. And they're just in much better shape to receive it. Well, what we want to tell you about is we have a training program called Elevating Feedback. And what we found is in this pandemic, there is a significant, the number one biggest difference between the leaders that did really well in the pandemic and those that did poorly is that those that did well were able to balance the drive for results with concern for others' needs. And so people in this pandemic, people right now really need good feedback. And this is a short, high impact online course. It helps people improve their skills in feedback. And every leader that attends this course, or every individual contributor that attends this course, you can send both, they actually receive the feedback preferences self-assessment. Now, what's interesting about this self-assessment is many, many people are shocked and surprised about their preferences. They don't really understand how much they prefer to give negative and avoid giving positive. That combination has a negative effect on that. And to have that insight really can help leaders, and it can really change their effectiveness. But so many leaders are unaware of this terrible tendency. So Jack, tell them about the free gift they're going to get on the after this feedback here, or after this webinar.
So our colleague Jim Foster will give you some more details about this, but basically what he will be describing is that there is a feedback preferences assessment that we're making available to you, which will give you some kind of a better insight into your preference for giving negative corrective feedback or for giving positive and reinforcing feedback. We think it will be a very useful bit of insight for you. And you'll get a score back that will give you some window into your current preferences for doing one or the other.
You know, Jack, after your discussion on Gottman, some of you might want to have your spouse take this same self-assessment, just so they see their preferences too. And you can do that. So this will be kind of fun for you to give this to your spouse. So Jim, tell us a little bit about our special offer here.
Thank you, Joe. And thanks to everybody who contributed comments to the chat. We had some very robust chat. Feedback is a very complex topic, and in many cases, the questions that came in will require some pretty complex responses. So we look forward to reconnecting with everybody on that. And if you have found today's presentation intriguing, we do want to make a special offer available to you as a way of thanking you for participating today. In terms of the Elevating Feedback Workshop that Joe just talked about, we do deliver this virtually. And it is coming up on December 1st and 4th. We can make this available to all of today's participants for only $200. We'll be sending out a discount code to you in our follow-up email. If you have any questions about the workshop, what the experience is like with the participants, please reach out to us. We'd be very happy to talk to you about it. And Joe mentioned the Feedback Preferences Assessment, which is a component of the Elevating Feedback Workshop. I want to be very clear that the mini assessment we are offering is a condensed version of what you would do in the workshop. We'd like to offer this to you now on a complimentary basis. It will launch at the close of the webinar. If you would fill out your post-webinar survey, you should receive it immediately. Or you can paste the address on the slide into your browser, and that way to be sure that you can get this. I will read it out just to make sure everybody's got it. It's https://bit.ly/ZF-October, OCTOBER. You will also find this address in the chat field. We look forward to reconnecting with everybody and hope you'll take the assessment and develop some very useful self-insights. Thank you.